To dig deeper into today's topic, we'll be talking with our expert Hong Chu. Hong is a lecturer at Harvard Kennedy School and fellow on technology and race at Stanford University. He was one of the first engineers on YouTube's startup team and is the creator of AI Blind Spot. So Hong, what is artificial intelligence in your words, and why do algorithms have potential for bias?
So I think of artificial intelligence as an aspirational technology. We're definitely not creating intelligence that's artificial. We're creating algorithms and methodologies that codify a set of rules and try to detect patterns in big data sets. And so once we detect the patterns, we try to build a model. And the model might be very accurate and may be able to even predict what future things might happen, depending on whether a new observation or a new case fits the model and it attempts to make a prediction or decision. So that's what I think algorithms today do and how they work in various aspects of society, anything from ad recommendations, content recommendations, to predicting the test scores of students, to screening resumes, and allocating healthcare resources, and so many other things. And the reason they have potential to not just cause bias, but also, more importantly, to be harmful to certain groups of population and people and individuals is many of the algorithms are written without knowledge of the context of the people who are subjected to these algorithms. When I worked at YouTube, I worked on teams that build many of these algorithms for, let's say, related videos or detecting fraudulent activity. And we always focused on the outliers. We try to find some of the most relevant, but also some of the most improbable activities. But we didn't have a context of how can we ensure that at the individual level, every person who's subjected to these algorithms have a sense of personhood, right to fundamental human and civil rights, and also, if nothing else, be given a level of human dignity that everyone deserves. I think as engineers, that's not something that comes naturally, and we don't think in terms of the requirements that maybe some of the legal counsel or the policymakers prescribe when they have protected classes to ensure there's a minimum level of protection against harm. And that's why I feel like AI, as it's deployed and affects people's lives, in specifically certain subpopulations, subgroups, who just in society are already being treated unfairly, will codify and ossify these rules and maybe continue to amplify these historical trends that we're trying to prevent and do better with.
Can you talk a little bit about how has AI bias impacted society today? What are different ways in which it is affecting our daily lives? Why policymakers are trying to regulate it?
Sure. So with a team of data scientists and civil society leaders, I'm working on a project called AI Blind Spot. And the notion is that in AI systems, the people who are building these technologies and services and deploying them in real life situations have to be aware of their own blind spots, have to be willing to find those harmful impacts. And if worse comes to worse, have to set criteria, not just to mitigate or to fix these biases, but to actually shut down these services and AI systems altogether. It's really important because in society, there's always winners and losers. And we already have such a widening, increasing gap in wealth and income today. The probability or the trends might be exacerbated by automated decision making left up to these algorithms, because the stakeholders who have a say in how to shape these algorithms, how to set the rules and make the rules for the code, they are sometimes unintentionally creating these negative consequences, but at times maybe intentional in setting these gatekeeping functions. So that's why we're working together closely with civil society organizations to identify who's being harmed, how they're being harmed, how they may be co-creators and participate in the decision-making process. To sum all this up, I think it's a lot of it is the history, the sociology, the psychology of all the people who hold the power. So it's a matter of the cultural norms, the ideologies, and also the dynamics and structures of power that determines whether AI systems work towards social justice or continue to exacerbate unfair outcomes.
And what I think about this is how a representation of particular groups is already so behind. And a lot of my work was about women's representation and like how much needed it is, how it's been lagging behind, how we're like almost centuries behind in having like women's texts published or women making media themselves, stuff like that. And it's interesting because I was writing this, like a few years ago, like the AI technology has progressed much faster than we have been able to catch up with these baseline issues of representation. And if the algorithms are being trained on what already exists, then basically technology has gone way farther ahead than even equalizing historical representation. So there's kind of like no other way to go but to fall into this kind of like exclusionary pit of technology. It will be exclusionary because knowledge has been exclusionary historically.
That's exactly what I'm seeing when I try to analyze and unravel some of the research in AI ethics. I think we often think that with the assumption that AI systems are impartial, unlike humans, because they never have a bad day, they don't have a bad attitude, they don't have prejudices. It's all fair because the rules are set and they just apply the rules. So you can't blame the algorithm, you can't blame the machine. That's a very naive and sometimes a pernicious way of categorizing automated decision-making by AI systems. You can't divorce the historical context. You cannot train it with data that's not representative, as you said. The data that it sees is not just all the goodness of humanity, but also all the cruelty and the injustices that we perpetrate. Therefore, I don't know of any algorithm that can distinguish and discern the difference between these two. So if you take all of the internet images or the internet, let's say Reddit conversations, there will be tremendous bias, and that has been happening again and again in these big AI models that's trained on these imperfect or even these very gross exhibits of human behavior that happens sometimes on the internet. Therefore, I think the question is not so much how do you have just a representative data set, because that's an easy way out. That's maybe a technical solution. And these technical solutions tend to actually cause more harm and create more unknowns and unexpected outcomes. What we really have to be aware of is we have to understand history. And once we understand the history, I like to use the term, we need to level the playing field for everyone to have equal opportunity and equal access to live a fulfilling life, to have life chances that some of us may enjoy, but not all of us today. And so if that's the kind of purpose of AI systems, then anyone who's building these systems, including the corporations who attest to having responsible AI, accountable AI, transparent AI, they also should declare this is their mission, this is their purpose, even if there's some sacrifices for them in terms of business objectives. Right now, I think that's not the case. And that's why we're seeing this kind of tug of war within many organizations between doing the ethical thing and doing the profit-driven shareholder wealth accumulation way of applying AI. I'm not saying you can't reconcile these two, but I think it takes a lot of serious conversations, a lot of high-level decision-making in order to create this combination, this blending of AI for level the playing field for everyone to have an equal chance in life. And that hasn't changed. That's still always the end goal of not just technology, but anything in society. So I think that's the right thing to do.
And that's why we're seeing regulators get involved with this. And regulators around the world have started drafting AI regulations, with the European Union taking the first steps with the proposal that they launched, I think a few days ago, a draft of a proposal towards harmonized rules on artificial intelligence. Can you talk a little bit about, have you read the proposal? Like, what's in it? And I guess the question, as usual, is this even implementable? What's in the draft?
Yeah. So first, I have to preface this by saying I'm definitely not a policy expert because I'm learning as I go. I come from a user-centered design background, and I worked in industry for many, many years in journalism, in these tech platforms. But just about 3 years ago, I switched my career path to go into understanding public policy, law, and thinking of ways to regulate or set norms and standards for emerging technologies such as AI. So given my understanding, I break down policy into maybe 3 or 4 stages. The first stage is this making of the policy, awareness that we need some regulation, some rules of the road, and possibly you draft it and maybe the next step is to pass it. And once you pass the regulation, which I think the EU has not passed their AI policy yet, but they have passed GDPR, which is already passed. So after it's been passed, the next stage may be to implement it. And implementing a policy is not as easy as it sounds. You have to interpret it. You have to make sure everyone knows about it so they follow the policy and stay within the rules. And there's lots of lawyers involved. I'm sure all the GDPR, I acknowledge this cookies clicks, that's implementation. And then even post-implementation, there's enforcement, which is probably the toughest thing, to maybe have a court or a regulator say you violated this law, and therefore maybe you're legally liable. You should pay a penalty, or you should make whole the person you harmed. And that is rarely done and very hard to kind of, quote unquote, get those cases through the system to the finish line and then to maybe set some precedent. There's another route where, if the policy is enforced, then is it enforced the same way harmoniously around the world, or even within a single country or jurisdiction? And then, how should we set expectations for every player around this? So I realized that writing code actually feels like pretty simple compared to this whole policy making and regulation work. And once you make it and you pass it, you can't just iterate like every 2 weeks. You better make sure it's good for 5-10 years at least. So look at some of the safe harbor Communication Decency Act. It's taken more than 20 years to even think about changing these laws. So there's a lot of pressure to get everything in order and do it right, including there needs to be a very sophisticated understanding of product and consumer psychology and the incentives for all the different players in the marketplace. And therefore, I feel like we're just in taking the baby step, the very first kind of learning to crawl, not even to walk from a regulatory perspective, and kind of values, the principles make a lot of sense. I think the Europeans are far ahead of the Americans in thinking of data and digital and privacy rights as opposed to consumer protection, meaning if the company harms you, you as a consumer want to get some financial benefit. It shouldn't be that way. It should be you have a right to your data. If the corporations or any entity uses your data without your permission in a different context and doesn't have this kind of data minimization, this spirit of limiting the secondary uses of your data, then they're at fault. They already gone beyond my willingness to provide my data for multiple users, which happens a lot when I was at Google or YouTube. They'll throw anyone's data into this machine learning algorithm for AI systems without a second thought. They say, oh, it's anonymized, so who cares? It's in the aggregate. I feel like that's a big mistake. The rule should be in the context, should be holding to the integrity of that single context, whether it's search or Gmail or anything, but not for another context to use it as a secondary other than that specific use. I think that would protect people's rights and give them much more power over their data flows will be under their own control. Therefore, the Europeans, I think, have the right spirit in mind. It's a matter of the actual implementation now. And some people have already reacted very strongly against these rules because they say you're killing AI, you're killing the whole marketplace and the industry of AI by imposing these requirements for high-stake AI decisions that needs to be transparent, that needs to be explainable, that needs to be registered and monitored, and that needs to have a sense of due process and recourse. But I think in order to protect everyone's fundamental rights and human dignity, that's something we all have to be willing to go do the extra work and set up these processes. Otherwise, I think, at least for myself, I don't want any part of it. I don't want to work for those organizations that produce those kind of products that may be harmful. So that's my personal take on where we are and where we should be going.
The US has also been holding a couple of hearings about algorithmic bias lately. And the FTC posted a blog that created quite a stir, which was, more like best practices for AI deployment. But if you look at the EU regulations with the high risk or low risk AI systems or deployment, how would, and if let's say ad tech falls into this, right? I wonder what you think is going to happen with first US regulations and the conversations that are happening here. And second, if let's say they were to follow European footsteps, how would that affect the business models for big tech?
So I think again, these are very early days of regulation, and the hearings themselves are just trying to identify the problems, to define the problem space in the US. So I believe the US will have its own path. The Europeans will have their own path. Many different states in the US will have their own path. And this kind of, in a way, kind of competition and iteration approach to regulation may be a good thing because you have good ideas that will arise out of this mixing of ideas, and maybe we can incorporate some of the best ones into one set of ultimately standardized regulations. But I think just going straight to the business model question, with if there was very strict guidelines and prohibitions, requirements for high-stake AI systems that may get in the way of people's life chances and treat people unequally based on a variety of possible biases that seep into these systems. I think it's best to actually do the research to know where the problem arises and to interpret and to be able to explain the problems, just like any product. I'm learning that in legal theory, legal scholarship, you ask the people who are creating a product that they should have a duty to care make sure the product works, is safe, is reliable, been tested. So first you ask the question, are the issues foreseeable? And if they are foreseeable, then is there any negligence in the team that's building it to not foresee it? And then if there is negligence, are they culpable? And if they are culpable, then what kind of liabilities should they have? And once they're liable, what kind of penalties or punishment should they have to live with? And then that's typically the logic of how to hold the developers and the operators of AI systems accountable, and also to deter future abuses of the technology to harm certain vulnerable populations. You have to think of AI as nothing more than an agent. Even before technology, we always had agents. Every bureaucracy had a set of rules, and you had civil servants, contractors actually executing these set of rules as agents of these systems. And the making of these rules has to be very transparent and scrutinized. Therefore, AI, I don't think should be any different. AI algorithms, AI systems, AI decision-making should be explainable and should be understood, and should offer whoever's been denied a chance, not just an explanation, but a counterfactual, a way for them to, improve their application to be approved. And they also should have recourse if they are harmed. For example, we are doing some research on rental screening applications. If someone who applied for an apartment is required to do a background check, and for whatever reason the background check inaccurately or unfairly denies them the rental property, and they lose the rental to someone else, they should have some recourse, because in fact they are qualified, but the technology was at fault. So all these protections for the consumer should be written into the regulation. The businesses should operate and be guided by these rules. And I think ultimately, once there's clarity around these, regulatory expectations and requirements, it's best for everyone. And I would just add one last thing I noticed is that you notice that facial recognition is one of the most contested spaces, because it tries to identify people by their face and possibly try to guess at their gender or their race. I think one of the reasons facial recognition is easier to contest is because we know how our face looks like. We know our own identities. There is a ground truth of what are the facts that we could agree upon. But many of these other algorithms that try to predict social outcomes, such as your ability to do a job based on the resume or your, video interview, it's maybe a lot more subjective, and it's less subject to a ground truth reality. We don't know until maybe when they actually do the job whether they're good at the job. But the algorithms pretend to, be very decisive and know what outcomes will happen. Therefore, the transparency is even more urgent and more necessary, because unlike biometrics and facial recognition, to contest algorithms that are high stakes, that prevent people from to be given opportunities to be shown ads, for example, for a job they are very qualified for because of some random bias, not random, but some glitch in the system that creates this algorithmic bias and data bias. We have to be able to catch that at every point, just as like any product should be able to catch its bugs and its issues to guarantee a good experience, a good product. That's by the definition what we are aiming to do. So it's very important to have this feedback loop in my mind.
Thank you, Hong, so much for your time and for explaining all of this to us.